Salam sejahtera bagi kita semua. Berjumpa lagi dengan saya di channel Penabur Benih. Saudara yang dikasihi Tuhan, bagaimana kabarnya hari ini? Semoga dalam keadaan sehat dalam perlindungan Tuhan kita Yesus Kristus. Dalam kesempatan ini saya akan membagikan lagi video kesaksian seorang muslimah Iran yang sedang berjuang, di mana mereka melawan perjuangan aturan yang ketat di Iran, dengan banyak yang berani melepaskan jilbab di muka umum sebagai bentuk pembangkangan sipil yang kuat. Bahkan di awal tahun 2026, Iran, khususnya wanita, mereka merasa bebas dari rezim yang sedang berlangsung selama ini. Meskipun mereka menghadapi resiko penangkapan dan hukumannya akan masuk penjara, mereka terus menuntut kebebasan dan hak asasi manusia, didorong oleh generasi baru yang lebih berani. Dan saat ini mereka gelombang perlawanan terus berlanjut, di mana banyak wanita, terutama di kota besar seperti Teheran, berjalan tanpa hijab sebagai aksi pembangkangan sipil terhadap aturan wajib. Karena itu mari kita melihat dulu bagaimana Anahita ini, seorang wanita Iran yang sedang berjuang melawan aturan tersebut yang berkaitan dengan kewajiban hijab. Mari kita menyimak video berikut ini.
Hello friends, this is Anahita. If you don't know me, I was born and raised in Iran until age of 19. I was involved in the anti-regime protests that happened in Iran in 1999, and I had to migrate for my own safety. I am going to be sharing a series of videos on Iran and real stories of people like me, my family, and people I know, so that you can get a clear picture of what this government and regime is capable of. Because there is so much disinformation all over the internet suggesting that the regime itself is not capable of the violence that is being perpetrated upon our people. So I'm going to start with my own stories, and then I will share my family stories and stories of others. As a teen growing up in Iran, especially as a female, there are so many hurdles that you have to overcome. From the compulsory hijab and the relentless enforcement that is out in the streets harassing people for anything from wearing makeup to showing any amount of hair to walking with a male. They will be questioned. They'll be stopped. They'll be questioned. They'll be harassed. They'll be arrested, imprisoned, tried. And I have personally experienced all of this myself. And I'm going to give you just a few different examples. And one is when I was in the university, studying in Tehran University, there were people at the door to make sure that you had full coverage and no makeup on as you entered school. So that wasn't an issue within the school grounds. However, I was walking in the school grounds one day just during a break, and the clergy enforcer walked up to me and asked me to follow him to his office. I asked why, and he very sternly and rudely repeated that, "Shut up and just follow me." So I went to his office, not knowing why I was there. He sat me down and I asked him, "Why am I here? I have proper hijab. I don't have any makeup on. What is the problem?" This is what he said to me. "You have your hands in your pocket, walking around with your head up and your chest open as if you own this property." Just let that sink in. A woman that has her head up, walking with confidence, is a threat to this regime. They were trying so hard to crush women's souls that even walking with confidence is a threat to them. So let that sink in and just imagine how you would feel. Of course, me being the defiant me, turned around to him and said, how do you know that I was walking the way I was walking? He said, I saw it. And I said, isn't that haram? You're not supposed to look at women. Why aren't you looking at me? He was really upset. He started yelling and telling me that he was going to expel me from school if I continued on. I said, I heard you, and I walked away. So you take that in and you put yourself in the position that I was in and see how you would feel about this regime and its oppression of women and the extent that they're willing to go to not allow women to even breathe, to not have their head up, to walk with their chest open, with their hearts open. That's what we're up against. This is the second video in a series of experiences of a woman living in Iran. I was 16 years old when I was waiting for a taxi to go to church. And one of the militia cars stopped by, the morality police, and they told me to get in the car. And I said, I wouldn't. Why would I get in the car? And they said, well, you have makeup on. And I said, well, I'll clean my makeup. I didn't have much makeup on. I just had some mascara on. And they were men. Back then, they weren't so bold as they are now to touch women. So I said I wasn't going to get in the car, and they couldn't really touch me. What I didn't know was that there were women behind in the back seats. And those enforcement women came out with Kalashnikovs in their hands and forced me into the car with my friend, both of us. And they gave us napkins to clean our makeup. I had heard many, many stories that they would put razors inside the napkins so that when you tried to clean your makeup, it would cut your face open. So I grabbed the napkin out of my friend's hand to inspect it. And that enraged these women, enraged them. And they had this paper, this form with a long list of makeup items and violations. And so she said, oh, you want to do it like that? And so she started check marking every single makeup item and every single violation, even though I didn't have them. So they took us all over the streets and a whole other neighborhood. And then they dropped us into a bus. And they've been going around all day collecting women and dropping them into this bus. And my family had no idea where I was. So the bus took a few hours until the bus filled up. And then they drove the bus to a whole other part of town into the morality police jail. And they jailed us. There were so many beautiful women in that jail cell. So many courageous women in that jail cell yelling and talking back at them. I was terrified. I was only 16 years old. I was stuck there for a long time. And I had to call for someone to come and put a bail to release me. And so I called my uncle because I was scared of calling my dad. And it took many, many hours before they came to bail me out. And I was terrified. I was scared of what was going to happen to me and how upset my family was going to be with me for the crime of wearing mascara. And we had to go to court. So I went to the morality police court. I had to miss school to go to the court. And it was very scary. You don't get representation. You just stand there in front of a cleric that tells you what your sentence is. So as I stood there, a frail 90-pound, 16-year-old girl, I had to beg for my life. And the clergy sentenced me to 35 lashes. I was absolutely terrified because as I was waiting to go inside, I saw women that had just received their sentence of lashes with literally all of the skin on their back completely gone, bloody backs, ripped pieces of skin, and you could see the bone. That's what I witnessed. And I begged him. I told him that we are a Christian minority. We try our best to follow the rules. If you could please just allow us to make a donation, keyword, donation, to get out of the lashes, because I knew that it would deform me for life physically and obviously scar me for life, more than I had been scarred emotionally. And so as I begged him, he went on a rant telling me how Christians are ruining the country, how we are infecting the country with our belief systems. Finally, I convinced him to let us purchase the lashes. And it took 2 months of my father's income to be able to buy those lashes and walk away. And so this is the reality. If that's what they're willing to do for simply wearing a mascara in the street, imagine what they're willing to do to the protesters that stood up against the regime and talked back and had slogans of calling for the end of the regime. These people, these young souls, these brave souls that have been imprisoned right now are being tortured and raped and probably going to get killed in prison. So even when they say we've stopped the executions, it doesn't mean that people aren't dying in prisons. You should know the facts. These are the facts. This is the third video in the series of stories from inside Iran, and this is one of the stories of Shirin Ebadi, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Iran, who's a human rights and women's rights activist. I came to learn about the story in one of her books called Until We Are Free. I strongly recommend it. It's available in English and on Audible. And she tells the story of her traveling in 2009, and while she was away traveling for a conference, the unrest in Iran unfolded. And a lot of her colleagues and friends were arrested. And so she was advised against returning to Iran at the time. Little did she know that she will never return. And her husband was left in Iran, not a political person whatsoever. And he was forbidden from leaving the country. And many years passed with husband and wife separated. So about 3-4 years in, she couldn't get a hold of him. About 10 days or so, he calls her finally in tears, asking for her forgiveness. He continues on to tell her that he was recently invited to a mutual friend of theirs' house for support. And while he was there, an old friend of his who he had dated prior to knowing Shirin, some 35 or so years prior, she came over. And suddenly, their hosts got a phone call and had to leave. And so he was left there alone with that woman, and the woman began to take off her clothes and seduce him, and he succumbed to his desires. Within minutes, security forces walked into the room with cameras and recorded the encounter, arrested him, and sentenced him to death by stoning. Then they told him on the morning that his sentence was to be carried out without any trials whatsoever, that he had the option of going on national TV to offer false confession about Shirin and her ties to foreign governments and how she's a paid agent of foreign governments. So when you hear the narrative around protesters being paid agents of foreign governments, know that there is a long track record of this regime manufacturing false confessions, manufacturing news stories and narratives that suggest that anyone that speaks up against them, that highlights human rights violations in the country, even within the confinements of the law, to them has to be labeled a foreign agent. So unfortunately, or perhaps fortunately, it's hard to know, he did offer that confession and was released. There's a whole lot more to the story, but I really encourage you to go study the works of human rights activists in Iran. People who are devout Muslims, who have ethics, and have been a champion of women's rights and human rights, trying their best to shift the conditions within the country. And this is the answer to them. So just imagine what they're willing to do when people stand up and actually say that they want to end the regime. Know the facts, learn the stories. Stories are some of the most powerful ways for us to decipher. This is the fourth video in a series of stories from inside Iran, and this one's especially heart-wrenching. And I really want people to understand what happens to political prisoners in Iran. My own uncle was a revolutionary during the revolution. He was a member of the Communist Party inside Iran. He was misled, frankly, and he was arrested shortly after the revolution, even though he was one of the people who brought on the revolution. And he was a political prisoner for a very, very long time. In about 10 years or so, he was going to get released. So we were very happy that he was coming home. And there was a big party that was thrown on the day of his release, waiting for him to come back. And as we all gathered as a family, little did we know that a few days earlier, he had called my mother and my uncle and asked them to not allow his mom and children and wife to come to receive him when he was getting released, because they were being forced to go on TV and do forced confessions, suggesting that they were paid agents of foreign forces. And it was a big lie, and he wasn't willing to do that. And he said that his comrades who had refused when families came to take them, they were supposed to get released. Instead, they were handed a box of chopped up body parts. So they were murdering people because they weren't willing to go on TV, even though they had served a decade plus in prison. So my mom and my uncle were absolutely terrified as they were going to pick him up, with a real chance that they're going to be handed a box of chopped up body parts and bones. Let that sink in. This is what they were willing to do 30 years ago. Luckily, by some miracle and grace of God, he was released. He was frail, he was quiet, and he was never the same again. This is what they do to people: physical torture, psychological torture. They destroy families. And this is the faith. And much, much worse, perhaps, for people that are imprisoned in Iran right now. So be our voice. This isn't complicated. This really isn't complicated. This is an evil regime. Moral clarity is imperative right now. Stand with us. Thank you. The fifth video about stories from inside Iran. And this is an interesting one, because often when we talk about the brutality of the Islamic regime, people will say things like, oh, well, they're following their religion. So here's a great example for you to know that they're not following their religion. Two examples, in fact. Armenian minorities in Iran are allowed to have alcohol, create their own alcohol, mainly wine, because of religious purposes. We're allowed to brew our own wine. We're not allowed to share it. We're not allowed to transport it. We're not allowed to do anything. So we're on a vacation, and we had some moonshine in the car, and we were playing as kids in the woods, and the militia came. They surrounded our families. There were multiple families, and they asked all of us to cover our hair, and yelling and screaming, and they went through our cars and they found the moonshine. And possession of alcohol is punishable by 100 lashes and a hefty fine at the very least. And they found them. We were so terrified, and my parents talked to them, my dad and my uncles talked to them and bribed them to let us go. The following day, we got wind of the news from the neighbors who knew people inside the Islamic militia, local militia where we were vacationing, that they had come upon a treasure of moonshine when they harassed a bunch of people, and that later that night they were partying inside the police station and drinking and laughing at us. So no, they don't even believe what they preach. They're just out there to harass people and to extort from people. Same thing happened. I actually found out similar thing later, a few years later, when my uncle, who was making his own moonshine, had made friends with some security forces, and he would literally carry gallons, massive 5 to 10 gallon containers of alcohol inside the morality police station, and they would sit down, drink, smoke opium, and have the same veiled women who were harassing women outside for wearing a mascara out there dancing, belly dancing, stripping down. These people don't believe anything that they preach. For them, religion is a tool of control and oppression, not faith. So when we stand up in Iran and we speak up against the Islamist regime, we're not speaking up against religion. We're speaking about distortion of religion, weaponization of religion against civilians. So know the difference. Hear our voices, hear our stories, and know that when we're speaking up against the Islamic government, this is what the realities are on the ground.
Ya, demikian videonya saudara yang terkasih dalam Kristus Yesus. Itulah yang menjadi perjuangan muslimah Iran saat ini, di mana mereka juga ingin bebas dari rezim tersebut. Setelah Khamenei meninggal dunia, justru ini menjadi banyak tantangan terhadap pemerintahan di era sekarang, di mana gelombang perlawanan akan terus berlangsung, di mana banyak wanita Iran, terutama di kota besar Teheran, mereka sudah berjalan tanpa hijab di sepanjang jalan, di mana banyak sekali perempuan Iran aktif dalam demonstrasi menuntut penggulingan pemimpin tertinggi mereka. Dan hal itu sudah terjadi meskipun berisiko tinggi, termasuk penahanan semangat untuk berjuang tetap tinggi. Peran di sektor publik juga, meskipun ada pembatasan, wanita Iran juga dikenal berpendidikan dan aktif di berbagai sektor, termasuk politik. 17 kursi di parlemen saat ini, kedokteran dan aktivisme. Kita sudah mendengarkan apa yang disampaikan oleh Ibu Anahita ini, di mana ia berjuang tentang apa yang terjadi, apa yang ia alami, di mana mereka kalau berjalan dada dengan busuk, angkat kepala saja, membuka hijab, mereka diperlakukan dan bahkan mereka ditangkap dan bahkan diperlakukan dengan cara yang tidak baik, dilecehkan dan bahkan dicabuli. Saudara yang terkasih dalam Kristus Yesus, itulah yang terjadi pada saat ini, dan kita akan terus mendukung, mendoakan sehingga wanita Iran ini tetap juga berhak untuk bahagia di muka bumi ini. Mereka juga ingin menikmati hidup yang terjadi, karena negara Iran mewajibkan pemakaian hijab sebagai bentuk dan dari implementasi ideologi Islam pasca revolusi 1979. Namun Tajikistan dengan negara mayoritas muslim melarang penggunaan hijab sebagai dalih menjaga nilai-nilai budaya nasional dan pembangunan identitas nasional yang sekuler. Saudara yang terkasih, itulah yang terjadi ketika negara berurusan bercampur dengan yang namanya agama. Akhirnya negara jadi hancur, dan saat ini kita sudah melihat Iran seperti apa dalam tindakan Amerika Serikat dan bahkan Israel bertindak secara brutal melakukan pengeboman. Kenapa mereka melakukan hal tersebut? Ya karena memang mereka sudah menerima banyak laporan bagaimana wanita tidak dihargai dalam negara tersebut. Oleh karena itu, justru mereka bahagia berterima kasih kepada Trump dan Israel melakukan hal yang demikian, dan bahkan mereka berterima kasih karena Khamenei sudah tewas dalam perang tersebut, dan itu yang menjadi sasaran utama dari Amerika Serikat. Semoga video ini juga boleh terus menggugah hati kita untuk mendoakan Iran. Tuhan berkati.